Okay, everybody, back for the exciting conclusion. We have our last group here and a couple quick things before we get to COVID-19. So a couple weird ones out there, and most of these are very unique, are the idea of viroids and prions. So viroids are like viruses in that they are infectious and but they lack a capsid, a lack of protein coating. So it's essentially infectious RNA or infectious DNA. It is rare in animals, but there are some common viroids in plants that affect plants. So because of our immune system, the viroids typically do not infect animals. But prions can, and prions are actually even weirder than these others. Prions are actually infectious proteins. They are not genetic and they do not replicate in the typical sense. What they do is they are proteins that actually turn other proteins into bad shaped proteins. So you essentially start off with a change in a original protein somewhere, somehow, and it changes the shape, and that shape of that protein starts going around and finding good proteins and turning them bad. The most common example of this is mad cow disease. You probably have heard of that one. It's a protein that attacks some other proteins in the brains of mammals. It can actually infect, we think, all mammals, but it's very difficult to actually get. There was a mad cow outbreak in Europe, and it was tied to a problem in which they were actually taking the brains of cows that were slaughtered, and not many people want that. So it was considered waste. So they took it and would dry it out and grind it up and use it as a protein powder, and they fed it to cows. So of course there was this vicious cycle that the cows were actually eating the brains of other cows, essentially. And they obviously stopped this, and we've not had an infection for quite some time. Just so you know, when a human gets mad cow, it's not called mad cow because they're not a cow. It's called Creutzfeldt-Jakob, and I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's not Jacob, it's Jakob disease. And it can come from different organisms. It doesn't have to come from a cow. It's very difficult to diagnose, but essentially what happens is slowly but surely the proteins in these cells in the brain start getting misshapen and they stop working and the cells die. And it creates the brain of that organism starts getting a sponge-like appearance. It's got holes in it. And obviously that's problematic, and it is incurable, and we do not have any way to treat it at this point. But thankfully it is extremely rare. So that's an example. So we have our one prion, and these are the normal proteins, and it just slowly starts to change, and it obviously accelerates. And it can sometimes take, we think, up to 10 years to occur for these prions to actually take some serious effect. All right, emerging viruses. Where do they come from? So due to population growth, population density, rapid evolution, movement of populations, and one of the things that has been recently discussed a lot is the continued close contact with a lot of human populations with animals. That all of this leads to the idea that viruses could jump to humans. Vaccines are a huge important, they're actually really our only tool for fighting viruses. And we've been successful. We've successfully eradicated one virus from the planet. It was probably the most dangerous virus of all time, which was smallpox. And we did it by using vaccines. Essentially, the idea of a vaccine is that you use an attenuated virus. The simple way of thinking about that is it's a virus without its teeth. You take some sort of component out of the virus. Sometimes you take away the genetic information and it's just the protein code. Sometimes it's the full virus, but you've manipulated the DNA in such a way that it doesn't infect it. In the case of the earliest vaccines against smallpox, they were using something called cowpox, which is genetically similar, but clearly wasn't designed, it infected cows. And so even though it would get in humans and cause a very minor infection, you would, the human immune system would now be aware of what these virus particles looked like, and when a smallpox infection came along, it could fight it off. So viruses out there, COVID-19, of course, HIV, Ebola, avian flu, and obviously I'm going to focus on COVID-19 and try to give you as much information as I possibly can. So first, let me start off by saying that this information is the best I could do with what I have now, so it is probably out of date as soon as I hit record, honestly. So there's a lot of new information coming out. We don't really know a lot yet. It is such a new virus. This is not a virus that has been around for very long. So what we're looking at, a couple of things. First of all, the best evidence suggests that this virus has been around for not very long at all. Late 2019, we think November, December is when it really started in China. There were some people talking about it being around for much longer. That seems unlikely, and the reason it seems unlikely is that when we look at the genetics of this virus, it does not have a great genetic diversity. This is a RNA virus, so it usually evolves pretty rapidly. And you would expect it if it had been in the human population, and sometimes these viruses can sort of hide in local populations and then sort of escape, and we think that's what happened with HIV, for example. But it would not be able to, it would have, if it had been around for a long time, it would have created a much larger genetic diversity and would not look the way that it is. It is probably zoonotic origins, which is a fancy way of saying it came from other animals. And I know there's lots of ideas out there. It came from a lab. There's no significant evidence that that is true at this point. We may get more later on, but it appears to have a great genetic similarity to a virus they found in this animal called pangolin, and which is sort of like an anteater. But again, we think that it's unlikely that it would jump from that organism to humans. That seems very strange. But it may have come from the pangolins through bats. And again, there's more conspiracy theories out there. If you've ever seen a photo of bat soup, that's fake. It's not a fake image. It was filmed about a year before the coronavirus actually even existed, so the idea that that's where it came from is a little bit silly. Bats are in and around humans all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean that somebody had to eat a bat. It could have simply just come from being around bats. Breathing the same air is enough. Remember, that's how humans transmit it. So key figures. I did my best to catch all what I could here, but here is the problem. We still don't have very good testing. Certainly worldwide and even in this country, we do not have the ability to test everyone that we want to. So people that don't have symptoms or have very mild symptoms typically do not get tested. And because of that, these numbers may be very, very skewed. So when you look at a virus, you look at usually two very key factors. One is what is called the R-naught. And R-naught is the basic reproductive rate. It is this idea of how, when you have one person infected with this virus, how many people do they infect? So if that R-naught value is above 1, that means the virus is spreading. If the R-naught value is below 1, it is decreasing and will eventually die off. Right now, we believe that the R naught number, the best numbers we can predict are that it's in the 2 to 3 range, but it could be much, much higher than that if you consider some of the research out there that shows that that sometimes it may be up to 80% of people show no symptoms. So that means there's a whole heck of a lot more people out there that have the coronavirus right now that never showed symptoms and never got tested. So they're not included in these figures. So that would make this R naught figure much, much higher and could put it up in the range with some of the really highest ones. Some of the higher ones that we know of are things like the chickenpox and smallpox were very, very high on this number. Probably the record was measles, which some research shows that R naught value was up to 18, meaning that one person with measles would give 18 other people the measles. Now, another thing you have to consider is R naught values is not a set number. It can vary by behavior. So one of the things we've been doing is the social isolation, the bans on travel, all of that is meant to lower the R naught figure. If people come in contact with less people, we are going to lower that number. If people wash their hands, that's going to lower that number. If people wear masks, it's going to lower that number. All of these things are really important. The other important information out there is the case fatality rate. And this is, again, really difficult to know. If you look at the actual statistics out there, that number is 7%, which is very high. Not as high as some viruses out there. Ebola is clearly much higher. Smallpox was much higher. However, it's a big number. But again, that is based on confirmed cases. And remember, if we have all these asymptomatic cases out there, that number starts to drop lower and lower and lower. And we really don't know what that is. But that's still a significant number. And I also want to point out that this number varies considerably by different factors. It is much lower in young people under the age of 30 or 40. As you get above 40 and 50 and 60 and 70, those numbers start to go up much, much higher. And then if you add in other factors that we can look at, like risk factors like smoking. Smoking is a huge factor and people that are smokers are a much higher risk. If you needed another reason to stop smoking, there you go. Transmission is most likely water droplets in airborne, which is why the masks are so important. Although touching surfaces is possible, it is probably a much less significant way of transmission. And as far as biology goes, what we know about it so far is it attacks these proteins. The way it enters a cell, it's a membrane-bound virus. It attacks these cells by getting into the cells using this receptor called an ACE2 receptor. And these ACE2 receptors are common on what is known as type 2 alveolar cells. So these are cells inside your lungs, and those cells inside your lungs are specifically designed to produce this thing called a surfactant. Surfactants are things that produce lubricant that allow your lungs not to stick together, and which is why these people that are getting this virus seem to have so much trouble breathing. But it also affects intestines, brain. Some of you may have heard, like, one of the weirdest symptoms is a lack of sense of smell. We think that's when this virus actually gets into the brain. It can affect kidneys and heart. You may have heard about a lot of the things associated with this are blood clotting. And of course, there's vaccines in development. There's a nice image here. This is not specifically coronavirus, but it's a really good example. It's got the capsid, which is the protein coat, and then it's got the envelope. Those glycoproteins are really significant. They're called spike proteins in the COVID virus, and they enter the cell. This one is a little unique. So this viral RNA goes straight to making messenger RNA. So what is there is actually the messenger RNA. So we